doing it. Just hey everyone, looks like we have a full house here. Awesome. So I'm just gonna let Erica lead us today.
All right, sounds good. Since the recording's already going, we won't do a get to know you. I was on the fence
Well, I can
anyway, so I'll
stop
just
it.
that.
I can stop it if
I'm
you
fine
want.
either way. I don't know.
You're running the
Quick,
show. You give the commands.
yeah, quick poll. Anyone dying to do a get to know you? No one's dying.
Dying.
All right. All right, let's
Maybe
just
just
march
frame
on.
drawing.
I won't. I was gonna have you all share what book you read recently that was impactful, but really just because I wanted to use the platform that I read a really good book this week and I wanted to force everyone to read it, but I'll spare you all of that for the next time we do a get to know you.
Well, why don't you give us some arm twisting, Erica? You can share
All
your book
right, all
and
right.
not require us to share ours.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I just finished the book The Women by Kristen Hanna. Um, I don't know if anyone's read The Nightingale, but she wrote that, and this is her most recent release. It's basically about the women of Vietnam War, who are often forgotten, and it's a really good book, and it's full of twists and turns, but it really just makes you realize, right, that was in the 60s and 70s, how far women's rights have really come. So
Mhm.
I think it's also a good book about like hope of if you ever feel like, we're not making progress, that can indicate that, it is worth the fight that we're doing.
Hmm. And it's just called The Women
The Women.
okay.
Yeah, has anyone read that book, The Women? It just came out in
I haven't.
February, so it's a few months old.
No, I have
I
not.
ha
Thanks for the
I ha
recommendation, though.
I haven't, but a few of my book club people have, and we won't read it because half the people have already read it. So, but it's apparently really good.
Well, thank you,
All right.
Erica. And anyone I think is welcome to provide required reading anytime.
I like that. If anyone wants to read it and then chat about it, happy to do that. Or hear book recs from you all, because now I'm like jonesing for a good one.
I am accumulating so many books that I need to read, putting them all on my Kindle and hoping that they will get into my head by osmosis. And so far, only one or two have managed to make the journey.
That's good. That's one or two more than you had previously. All right, so today's topic, let me share my screen. All right, I think y'all are looking at my second desktop, which should just show. Yep, looks good. All right, so today's topic is going to be just a brief on some of the stuff that Pi and I, and with Marilee's help as well, have been thinking about in terms of what our research questions will be for the field study, specifically for the communications team. And I think I put RQs in the spreadsheet, and that might have been confusing and misleading. So it's about research questions, not requirements.
Sorry.
So I apologize for that. All right. So basically, I just wanted to like start with getting us all, understanding the timeline, and then how our data collection from the communications team plays into this timeline. Right, so I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago, right? We have this baseline period where we're measuring their baseline air quality before we do anything. Then for 6 weeks, we have the manual intervention or the automated, right? It's split between the two groups, so it's counterbalanced. Which you see first, right? So manual, they get a notification that their air quality is degraded and that they should turn on the system, right? And then the second 6 weeks is the automated condition where it just senses degraded air quality and turns on, and the user can override and cancel it if they don't want it. And then we do the post baseline, you know, don't have our intervention going anymore, and see what people's, you know, air quality is like without the device. So that's the baseline, like general of the field study, right? So understanding where some of the data that we're going to collect from the communications team is in here. And please, if you have any questions or comments, like feel free to raise your hand or interrupt me or whatever. I don't want to be the only one talking here. But so at the very start of the study, right, before we ever show them any information about their air quality, we were thinking of having a revised version of this weatherization survey. And the point of that is, like, I say revised because some of the questions in the weatherization survey are maybe more specific to people in the weatherization. So I think there's an opportunity to trim it a little bit because it's a pretty lengthy survey. And so, right, and the idea here is we can compare the smaller group of the in-home study to this larger weatherization group that hopefully we'll get. So that'll give us just a general understanding of their perceptions of air quality and, you know, household characteristics, and I'll talk a little bit about that coming up. And then Pi and I were thinking that after 1 week of having the intervention activated in their house, so this would be the HMI is on, so that in-home display and the actual device, like monitoring and filtering their air quality. 1 week after that has been, you know, activated in their house, we'll have this survey here to understand initial perceptions of this system. And then we were thinking at the end of this 6-week intervention, so that'd be the end of 8 weeks, we were thinking of having basically the exact same survey again to be able to compare how, now that they've had some exposure to it, what their perceptions. And I'll talk about what these perception surveys will actually contain coming up here. And then we'll do the same thing. So 1 week after they're in the automated condition, or again, right, if this is reversed, it's the second week of whatever the first week of the second portion, if it's automated versus manual. We'll have the same survey again to get a feel for, you know, what their initial perceptions of the way this system is working in their house. And then we'll do the same thing again at the end of that 6-week period for them. And in our original proposal, we proposed 5 surveys. But we were thinking potentially there could be some value with the 6th survey. I guess it really just depends how long that week 14 survey is, because this last one talk about this one. But we thought, you know, like, what about, you know, now that they've had the intervention taken away for 2 weeks, like, do they miss it? Like Pi and I were thinking about what this survey would look like, and he said it's kind of like a post-breakup survey, right? It's like, are they yearning for it back in their house? Would they be willing to, like, you know, invest in it, you know, not necessarily money-wise, but time-wise potentially, to get it back in their house, etc. So understanding that, like, the emotional connection they had with it. So they're all the surveys. So we're also in the meantime, right, collecting information with how they're interacting with this display device in their house. And so from that, during the manual and automated conditions, right, we can get which screen is activated, and we're going to have timestamps so we can get how long they were on each screen, which buttons they press, and, you know, at what time period. So that's an overview, a background, snapshot of the type of data we're collecting. So the whole purpose of today is to talk a little bit about what our actual research questions are and our research objectives, again, from the communications team. And these were roughly outlined in the proposal. So they are rooted in what the proposal said, but I think there was, you know, some flexibility and intentional ambiguity in the proposal. And so we've expanded and modified. So there's certainly opportunity for feedback from you all, what seems like novel or not interesting or, you know, vague or whatnot. So here are the 4 research questions. I'm just going to introduce them here, and, like, feel free to comment on them, but know that I'm going to do a little deeper dive into the type of data we're thinking about, and then dive individually research question 1, 2, 3, and 4. So you kind of have an idea of, like, all right, now you know what the data looks like what exactly are we going to, you know, get at with each of these research questions. So 4 research questions that we are thinking about. The first one is, what factors influence a user's decision to yield control versus choose to override their in-home AQ device? And I say in-home AQ device, meaning the intervention that the tech team is creating. And so research question 2 is, what type and quantity of information do users value for informing them about their at-home AQ? And this one, right, is more about just that information that we're providing them. And so it's outdoor air quality and indoor air quality. So that's why I say at-home AQ. Research question 3 is, how does user interaction with the in-home AQ device change over time? And so that's largely looking right at that, like after week 1 versus after week 6 survey. And then research question 4 is, how do user characteristics affect their interactions and attitudes towards the in-home AQ device, right? So we don't have a large sample size, right? We have 16 people, but maybe there's some unique characteristics of houses that, you know, correlate or predict like how engaged they are with this device, and what are those exactly. All right, so those are the 4 research questions. So let's take a look at a little more in-depth context about the type of data we're collecting, and then we'll revisit each of these research questions. I just saw it, Tammy, your comment in the chat. All right, so there's 2 parts, right? First is the survey data, which we're gonna disseminate across 5, potentially 6 surveys, depends how long they end up being. And Pi has a working draft of that right now, and he and I have a target goal of, next couple weeks to really finalize that. So the survey data. So the first is that weatherization survey that Paige, Marilee, and I started, several years ago, it seems like now, and that we're, have in the field and we just piloted. And that survey collects information about demographics of the household, general like cognitive load, like how much are they juggling in the household, their general maintenance behavior. So like, how often do they, change their lint trap or in their dryer, or change the oil in their vehicle, or, get new tires, right? Other things that might be analogous to like having to change a filter in an air quality or in a, air filter device. Health risks, so like, does someone in their house have asthma, or other health risks that might make them more keen to be interested in air quality. And then just general perceptions of air quality, right? Like, are they oblivious to air quality? Are they already interested in this topic? So that's kind of what the weatherization's getting, just baseline, what people's perceptions and behaviors are. And so then we've been spending a bit of time looking at the literature on what established and validated surveys already exist, specifically looking at like technology interventions and, adoption of such interventions. And so Pi's come up with a handful here that we're thinking about implementing. So the first is this modified post-user system usability questionnaire, which is a mouthful, but it's basically, I think, like maybe 10 or 12 Likert scale questions. And it ends up giving you a subscale for how useful someone perceives a system to be, the quality that the system provides them information-wise, the quality of that interface, that like interaction device, and then their overall satisfaction with the device. And in this case, we're tailoring it all to that, technology intervention we're doing. And for those of you that maybe haven't done a lot with like validated surveys, usually, there's, maybe 10 to 20 different Likert scale questions, like, I think the system is reliable, I think the system is useful, right, etc. And then, you perform, the people that develop the scale, right, perform generally a factor analysis, and they group them into subscales. And so overall, right, there might be 20 questions for this survey, and then like 5 of those relate to system usefulness and 6 relate to information quality. So that gives you a general score for how much someone, is satisfied or values the information. So that's how some of these surveys work. So we'll see those in a second as well. And so that's kind of a really brief background of how those come to be scales. And also why we're not like necessarily inventing our own scales, because there's quite a bit in the literature that we can utilize. And I think many of you are aware of this, but Pi also works part-time at Google, working on their vehicle interface system. And so he's been doing a lot of this also. in the car industry. And so he's been utilizing some of the scales that he's found useful and not useful, and leveraging for them for us as well. So that's where a lot of these scales have come from. We also have the system usability scale, which we think we've decided not to use potentially because there's a lot of overlap with that scale I just mentioned. And then similar, the questionnaire for user interface satisfaction, another scale that we thought has too much overlap. We also have the technology acceptance model, and that's basically just 12 questions, again, on a Likert scale, and that gets at perceived ease of use. So how strongly someone believes that this technology intervention is like easy to use. And also gives a subscale for perceived usefulness. So how useful they think the device is for, their goals. And then the last established scale is the Geon Trust Score. It's, I think it was in 2000 it was developed. It was really developed for trust in automated systems. And there's 12 Likert scale questions there. And then we also thought, right, like kind of a catch-all, we'll add some more additional survey questions that we don't think necessarily we got that are of value. So we were thinking of showing them like screenshots of their display, that in-home, display that they get, and saying like, if you were to see this display, is the air quality good or bad, or how would you react, or, should the system be on, right? To just get at like, do they interpret and recognize the information that we're actually displaying on their screen? And then maybe like perceived costs that they think the system like costs to run in their house. And, that might indicate whether or not they're overriding the system or not. We've also talked about noise. So that's some of the scales, the surveys that we're collecting. And Allison, I see your point in the chat. Let me just read that really fast. Yeah, so that's a really good question. Pi found a couple of papers that he has shared with me that kind of get at this. I don't know, Pi, if you want to speak on that. But that really guided his like thinking about the design of the user interface that he presented on, a couple weeks back.
Yeah, I remember the design was really informed by the AQI stuff, or at least like it had come up. I think I was just realizing like, oh, do people interact with that information on the weather apps in any way that's like traceable? And then have people studied that? And it's outdoor and it's a different type of information. So maybe both you and Pi are like, no, there's not a lot of relevance there. But yeah, it's just a.
I think it's a good thing to add on to the weatherization survey, maybe. Like, how aware are you of that your phone or like, weather app shows the air quality index as well? Or like a question regarding, have you ever noticed the air quality conditions that your weather app shows you? And that could also give us a good understanding if, they're already primed with understanding what air quality is, or is it just a brand new concept to them that they just figured out in the survey? So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that tip, Allison. I think, maybe we'll dive a little bit more into that and refresh. I can't remember. I think when we talked about the weatherization survey way back when, that helped inform, but it's good to refresh that.
Yeah, and tempered, of course, against last week's discussion, where I think the length was certainly, a key constraint. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. So that's the general idea of what we're aiming for the survey data. And then I threw a couple of examples of these in here just to give you a visual of what these look like. And again, we're still wordsmithing them, right? Because none of them are specific to an air quality device. So, not necessarily something you need to look at or read, but I just want to give a little context to like when I say, some of these surveys, what that looks like. So this is the system usability scale survey. This is the technology acceptance model. So you can see like, for example, the left block gets at the subscale of perceived usefulness. And so the first question is getting it, we're rewording it, but it's supposed to get at how like quickly it helps you achieve air quality, how well it actually improves air quality, right? still a work in progress on making those make sense with the original wording and our application area. And then perceived ease of use is the block on the right side. And then this was the last survey block that I'll make you look at, but this is the GEON trust survey from the literature. And this gets like an overall, you know, at the end, someone will have a scale of how much they trust this or this intervention, and we can compare it to like previous conditions within our study, right? So like automated versus manual, or week 1 versus week 6. Yeah, Christian, great question. How are we administering the surveys? I think originally we had discussed pushing them through the HMI, although I think maybe lessons learned from this weatherization survey is offline Qualtrics has a lot of bugs. And so, yeah, I think that's a fair question to ask. With 16 participants, paper surveys won't be the end of the world either. So,
I'm just thinking it's
Still,
pretty small. Like, I think it's important to be able to see all the columns, right, in surveys like this. So it's a pretty small real estate on our screen, just my personal thought.
yeah, definitely. That's important for sure as well. Yeah, as you can tell with the 7-point Likert scale, yeah, like width is important. Yeah. All right, and so those were all the survey data. And then the last part is the device interaction data, right? So this is from Christian and Carson's device. And again, like we've been talking about, you know, we can collect, as Pi mentioned previously when he pitched his like idea of what this device screen could look like, right? We can see how long people spent on different dashboards. And so if one dashboard has like more context and the other is just a snapshot of indoor versus outdoor, like which did they choose to look at for their information? We also talked about, right, like having a snapshot in time, like your air quality is this right now, or your air quality has been this in the past, you know, 24 hours, right? So seeing what they choose to look at to inform them. We can look at where they click and when. This is particularly interesting, right, for when we have the notification and the notification pops up and it's like, hey, air quality is degraded. We advise you to turn your fan on, and they either hit like, yes, I want to do that, or no, I don't, or maybe like snooze, remind me in 30 minutes, or they just never press the button at all, right? And that's indicative of maybe they just never saw the notification as opposed to, you know, choosing not to turn the device on in the control condition, manual condition. And then we can also correspond that, right? We'll know what the air quality index was, the temperature, humidity, right, etc. And maybe there's like a threshold that people are like, oh, this is when I want to turn it on, or etc. Right? We can collect that information. And I kind of mentioned them under the manual conditions specifically, right, when they turn it on or off. And then I also mentioned this, right? The important distinction, you know, is it that they specifically chose not to turn the device on, or is it because they just never saw the notification? And that's something we're working through as well. So that's the type of data that we can get from that device, right? So now I wanted to spend the last bit kind of dissecting these research questions and thinking about, all right, well, now we know when we're collecting data and what data more or less we're collecting. So how does that inform these research questions? All right, so remember our first research question is what factors influence a user's decision to yield control versus choose to override their in-home AQ device? And so we went back and forth on the wording, and I don't know if it's necessarily wordsmithed yet, but right, the concept of yield control is to let the device function as it's intended, right? So let it sense air quality events, let it turn on and off accordingly, or under the manual condition, right? Like trust it and just hit yes, turn on. So it doesn't necessarily mean automated only. And then the override condition, right, is, you know, this maybe not necessarily relevant to this, but right, the concept of like changing parameters, again, maybe that's not the case here, but it's more like, right, you stop the device from functioning. So it's automated and you specifically turn it off, or it's under the manual condition and you choose to turn it on, even if you didn't get a alert telling you to, right? So these are the types of like triggers that we're thinking about for yielding control, like let it do its thing versus you thinking you know better than the device and overriding it for whatever reason. Whether it's because you don't think your air quality is degraded, or you don't want to hear the humming noise of our device, or you think it's gonna like increase the cost of your utility bill. And so we're hoping out of this to get a little insight on influences of people's preference towards manual versus automated control, right? Like, are people more satisfied with the device when it's automated and they're just letting it do its thing? Or people are like, I really want to know more about my air quality and I want to be, the one that's instigating whether or not it turns on or off. We have some hypotheses about maybe when each one is the case, but we're going to let the data speak for itself and understand, what leads to those different preferences. It also gives us the opportunity perhaps to understand within this research question people's stated versus observed behaviors, right? Maybe people are like, I want to have control over my device, but then their device interaction shows that they really, yield control to it and let it do its thing. And that's interesting as well. I've mentioned this previously, right? But people's stated preference is important to be able to like adoption, right? Like get people to buy into a system at the beginning, but then, adhering to people's observed behaviors is a good way to get them to like maintain it or to continue to use it as engineers design it. So a few hypotheses that we threw together for this research question is that trust in the system correlates with preference of automation. And that's nothing novel necessarily, right? Like the more you trust a system, the more you're going to let it be automated and be satisfied with that. But it's like, which elements of trust? Is it like the satisfaction of the whole device, entirely? Is it like specifically you're really worried about your air quality in your house for whatever reason? Is it, because you think the system is really clear and useful and you completely understand it, right? So really dissecting like what aspect of trust is leading to people like preferring an automated state or a manual state. We also, have this hypothesis that if people tend to value air quality more, right, they're probably going to yield control and, follow whatever instruction it suggests, whether it's automated or telling you to turn the filter on. And then, remember, we also have half our participants, I believe, are, have this built-in HVAC system versus the other half have this portable system, like portable air device that's not built into their HVAC, right? And so there's this out of sight, out of mind bias that people tend to have, where if you can't see it, then you forget it exists. And so maybe, that also has some element of people's preference towards manual control versus wanting to have it automated. So I guess that's research question 1. Any like initial thoughts or like reactions to that? Anything for us to keep considering as we're building that out? All right. So then let's talk about research question 2. So remember, research question 2 is what type and quantity of information do people value for informing them about their at-home air quality? And again, this is not like contained only to like the intervention device that we have in their house, but it's, like what the outdoor air quality is and what the indoor air quality is and how that might change depending on what their behaviors, inside the house is, if it's cooking, if it's, a wildfire outside, etc. And so this research question is really driving Pai's design of what he thought could be good interface screens and etc. for like the actual display. Right. And so one question is, right, like, do people interpret and understand the qualitative data versus the quantitative data better, right? So is showing people like an emoji of a happy face versus a frown face, resonate more or less with them as compared to just showing them like a raw number, like your AQI is 160, right? And understanding the different like types of households and what part of the study they're in, and maybe that changes over time as they become more educated in this topic after being exposed to their at-home air quality. I remember Pi also talked about showing a snapshot in time, right? So your air quality is this right now versus time series information over the past 24 hours or 15 minutes, whatever it ends up being, right? And so looking at where people click on the screen and spend more time looking at information. And then also, right, we're going to have additional survey questions like screenshots of the display and say like, if you saw this, what do you interpret the state of the air quality to be? And that can help us understand like if they're spending a lot of time on a screen, but they can't interpret the information correctly, like there's a big disconnect there, and that's important to understand. Right, thinking about event specific. So like if there's a wildfire, they're looking at the device more often. Is there different types of information they're interested in versus just like, ambient, they're always interested, and maybe specific household occupant characteristics influence this. Right, so like if someone has, again, like asthma, for example. And again, I think I covered this one, but how well they understand the displays. And so getting them to interpret the information in some of those survey questions to us can tell us if we're just showing a bunch of information that makes absolutely no sense to them. And then, right, we need to go back and think about how information is disseminated to the general public about their AQI. Okay, so that was research question 2. Any, I don't know, reactions or thoughts to that before we talk about research question 3?
I did have a couple questions. And Pi, I'm sure this is correct, so don't take this in a bad way. I'm assuming there will be pilot testing on the device such that, at least as far as that general understanding of what, of how people are interpreting the information on there, we would have that out of the way. And so it would be a little more nuanced as far as this, how well do they understand the displays part of it, correct?
I think that pilot testing is, always a good idea for sure. I guess it's like when the design is finalized and when we implement it into the house, it's like how much we pilot it. But yeah, that's a good point to like definitely make sure that we're piloting it. And so it's like nuanced. But I think as we learned with the weatherization survey, it can be a different demographic that we're analyzing compared to like what we expected and piloted on.
No, and I think that's a really key point. We have to know what the demographic is so we can pilot with the right group, because that's a key piece of the puzzle, because that does raise another concern that I think we can address too, which is like the problems that we're having with the other survey and the misunderstanding, or not, it's not a misunderstanding, it's like a lack of, I guess, experience with how some surveys are done and how questions are asked, that we need to adapt more to them. And so, some of those Likert scales and stuff like that could be really not great. So I think it's really key that we land on that group and that's the group that we're piloting all of our stuff on. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Marilee. I also think, right, like we're not necessarily inventing this like super novel way of telling people about AQI, right? Like we're using the air quality index. It's already established that you open up your weather app and that's what they tell you. And if you turn on the news at night, that's the information they tell you, right? So like if the information that is the status quo is not making sense to people, right? Like that's a super interesting finding in itself and could really like rock the world, and that would be exciting.
I would say no, only because you only have 16 people.
That's true, right? But
so,
it would be enough to like convince NSF to give us a bunch more money, right?
They've already they're giving EPA a whole bunch on this, but based on some other studies that I'm familiar with that are ongoing and some field work, it it kind of depends. You know, some people are more, what we find is that people who are caregivers, people who are at risk, yeah, they're more aware and they're paying attention because they've been encouraged to do that sometimes, and because, you know, and so I think AQI is still novel enough that it can be that you can get people who are like, oh, I hadn't really thought of that. Or they will, even around, you know, Fort Collins, they'll think that they won't recognize what poor air is. So I'm just saying that, but you're right. I mean, and they're actually coming out with, like, that's why the USDA is doing a new heat index, not USDA, I can't remember now who's doing it, but they're trying some different approaches in some places because they're realizing maybe it's not working so well, at least with heat. Yeah, sometimes it's just they're unaware because they've never paid attention. And other times it's that they don't see the connection between the two, you know, health and your AQI, that kind of thing. I think I think it'll be really interesting to see what these 16, you know, these families think, definitely. Because I haven't seen any data that has looked at AQI over this kind of a time period and what people think about their homes at all. It's largely outdoor, at least the stuff. I know there is some more that's newer, that's excuse me, that is, I think, looking at more in-home air quality as well.
Yeah, so I agree with both of you. Merely as you get involved and people in your department gain more information on larger studies, I think it would be wonderful to have that brought back to the team here. And then Erica, I totally agree. We're using the status quo, right? And we want to know if that's working. We're not one thing at a time. We're not inventing something new to try to reach them.
Yes,
I
thanks.
definitely think it makes sense to start with what is already out there, no question. You know, because that totally makes sense, and it has both the kind of that qualitative thing of color, and it has numbers in it, so it can serve both needs.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, both of you. Any other thoughts to RQ2 before we talk about RQ3, which is a good segue, kind of in what we've been thinking about in the last couple of minutes here. All right, so then RQ3 is really tailored at like our within subject comparisons, and so maybe that can provide insight. Like at the very beginning, no one understood anything about AQI or just general air quality, didn't even know they should care about it, but maybe at the end of the study, all of a sudden they cared. Maybe they didn't care at all, right? That's interesting as well. And so RQ3 is how does user interaction with our in-home AQ device change over time? And so thinking about our within subject comparison, so we're trying to have that survey that's done like 1 week in to your exposure to automation and the 6 weeks into your exposure to automation, and the first week after exposed to the manual control versus the 6 weeks in, right? We want all those surveys to be identical as much as it makes sense so that we can compare, like, you know, repeated measures, you know, time 1 to time 2 for participant 1, 2, 3, right? And so within subject measures tend to get more powerful changes and can, support a small sample size like we have of only 16, right? Between subject comparisons is a little hard to make like statistically sound conclusions from, but within, I think we're fine with our sample size. And so we're really looking at, within the automation stage, like if your survey questions from your first week of exposure versus 6 weeks of exposure, right? Like, how does that change? Do you perceive like more value in the system, less value in the system? Looking at the HMI data, right? Like your interaction data, did you stop touching the device? Did you start using it more? And same with the manual condition, but then also, right, repeated measures for participants for automation versus manual. So like maybe people chose to use the device a lot when it was under manual and never during automated. And then we also correlate that with their perceived usefulness of the device or their perceived satisfaction. It's like people are happier and they're using it more under some condition, right? So it's like taking all these different measures we're collecting and try to make sense on how they correlate together. And so for this one, again, we're really looking at like snapshots and comparisons within the same participants and their interaction and then their surveys. And then also like across the survey, right? We have this pre-survey about their initial perceptions of, air quality and, home health, etc., versus like the survey at the very end and like seeing after they've been exposed to information and an intervention, like, do they care more? Or have we not, convinced them that they should care? And maybe it doesn't matter that we've convinced them that they should care, but they use the automated device as it should, and we improved air quality, and right, that's a win also. So like looking at just how behaviors changed and perceptions changed. And so yeah, right, looking at like preferences, perceived value of both air quality information and also the device, and then like how their use of the device changes. So that's RQ3. I'll just pause if anyone has any reactions or thoughts to that research question.
I have a general question. Based on your experience with other settings like driving, I realize the home is very different. Do you expect, are there certain things you expect, or is this just wide open for you?
Yeah, I mean, in a driving setting, usually, right? Like you can see changes in people's behavior after just like interacting with the system after a few times. And so I think that, like, yes, a household is much different and maybe there's a lot more factors. We also have a longer period of time, like I think 6 weeks. I expect we would be able to see changes in people's behavior. Like one thing when I instrument vehicles for like naturalistic data collection, usually people are on really good behavior the first week or first few days of driving, and they know there's a camera watching them and collecting information. And then it's usually like 3 to 5 days they revert back to their typical behaviors. And so it's also kind of one thought for maybe doing it a week out. It's like maybe they're engaged a little bit more, maybe not, and that could be interesting to see.
I think a lot will depend on if we have events.
Yeah.
I mean, I do like the idea of coming in a week out, kind of to see that novelty piece of it. Whether there are events or not, they're probably going to be, oh, it's this cool new thing. But then, that over time, I'm really glad that, we can, that 6 weeks allows that. But yeah, I think it's going to vary with what happens.
Yeah, that's the other tricky part, right? Is like, yeah, what if they just get a lot of events during the automated stage and not during the manual? That could definitely mess with our data, but I think we're getting enough data points, being able to correlate it with those like real time events, that hopefully we'll be able to discern interesting things.
That's why the periods are long. Is that there's so much variability that it's hard to plan.
All right, so that was RQ3. Any other last thoughts or questions? All right, so then our fourth and last research question, and also the last slide that I have for today, is RQ4, which is how do user characteristics affect their interactions and attitudes towards the in-home AQ device? And this one is maybe embedded within some of these other research questions, but I think like having an explicit research question to remind us like, hey, how can we parse the data and group people, differently and see if their behaviors are similar? And this might be hard with 16 participants, 16 households. But again, we have like the weatherization survey, which is hopefully is a larger group. And so we can like compare them to you know, a larger sample size. Not 100% sure what that looks like yet, but the idea here is, right, we have a question in the weatherization survey about your technology adopter profile, right, based on Rogers's diffusion of innovations. And so are you an innovator, an early adopter, a late adopter, a moderate adopter, a laggard adopter, et cetera? And so like maybe we'll get a good number of kind of the earlier and maybe the later, maybe just later, right? But if we know what their adopter profiles are, perhaps that can help give us context in some of the answers to the survey questions or their interactions with the device, or be able to compare, you know, across profiles. In the weatherization survey, we also have questions trying to get at people's cognitive load, right? Like overall cognitive load, not like your cognitive load right now, but it's like I'm a caregiver for, you know, my parents and 8 children, and I don't have time to also worry about this, right? It's trying to get at those load profiles of what capacity people have, and maybe that is indicative of if they choose the manual control versus the automated control. We also, I mentioned this, have maintenance behavior questions. So like, do you wait till the last minute to get the oil changed on your car, or are you like, you know, every 3,000 miles or whatever that mileage is? You know, or changing the batteries in your smoke detector, right? We have a variety of questions to try to get at their general maintenance behavior profiles. And then also health risks, right? That could really influence how engaged someone is with this. If someone in their house has, you know, something that makes them vulnerable to air quality events, then maybe they are engaged more. So that's the idea of the fourth research question, is like parse the data or put it in context of why they're answering or interacting the way they are. All right, so I guess maybe open it up to both like research question 4 reactions, but also is there an obvious research question that we're like completely missing that y'all think, hey, it'd be interesting to think about this behavior? Maybe I'll put it back to research, all the research questions together. And if you don't have any, that's fine. You can think about it or know, you know, we're still iterating on this as well. And so any feedback that comes to you will be very valuable.
Erica, first of all, this is Allison. I really appreciate the organization of your talk today. And I know you kind of touched on it as you've gone, so try not to have you rehash. I am curious about the avoidance behavior, or the people that are the least interactive. Like, that seems to me the toughest to get good insight on why, and the whys seem like they could be very, very diverse. Is that primarily through the survey-based questions that you'll get insight onto, like, if people are not interacting or not interacting in certain ways or at certain times? Is it still through survey questions that you would get information on that? I'm calling it avoidance. I don't know what it is, like non-engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Allison. No, that's really good. And that's like, yeah, what if someone never interacts with the device, right? It's like, are they just not looking at it, or they really don't care? And like, hopefully our survey questions can like try to tease that out and parse it out. But I think that's a good thing to think about, like as we're finalizing the like interaction data and the survey data, and like think like, all right, what if we have someone that's really engaged? How might they behave? And what if we have someone that's like the polar opposite and they're not engaged at all? And like try to play through our head like how people would interact and respond, and make sure we're like catching all those nuanced behavior potentials.
Do you have the potential to do like follow up, like an interview, like, or no, maybe not?
I think we probably do. I don't know, Tam, I see you came off mute for a second.
Well, I was gonna say a couple of things. One, I think we could follow up if that seems appropriate. We want to make sure that we're not disturbing the experiment, so I would put that later. Another thing that we have not really discussed is I think we have intended to offer the users the intervention that they had to keep it or not keep it. I have not thought that out very well, but there could be some learning around that, like whether they choose to keep it or not. Again, that would be at the end. And so I don't know if we probably want to think about whether we would tell them that or not. And then the last thing is that every time we talk about this, it seems like there are so many things we could explore, and some of them are best done with a larger sample size. And so I'm really interested in noting those as we go along. Like, we're doing this now, we're not doing this now, but some of these could obviously maybe just go out to a much shorter experiment, how people interact with things, and they could be fodder for follow-on work.
Yeah, I think that's definitely good to keep in mind, especially if like we start to realize that our surveys are too long. It's like, all right, maybe we should save this for a different population. All right. Well, yeah, I appreciate everyone listening. Yeah, any other last thoughts or comments? Marilyn and Tammy, I see you went off mute.
Yeah, I just had one, and Ellison, I think it was a good point about, I think studies like this, and like Tammy, as you said, you always know, you find out more that you don't know, which is great, but is also a little frustrating, but then does offer opportunities for future studies. Along that, well, not quite along that lines, but one thing I think this does point out, or when I'm thinking of the whole study, is the influence of the information that we're going to have to provide for them to agree to be in the study, and the influence of that. It will be the same across everybody. So that's one thing. But if we were expecting that we might have people who are at kind of higher and lower levels of knowledge of air quality and some stuff like that, we may not really have that as much, depending on what information we're providing, when they sign up, and that kind of a thing. So that's just one thing to think about, not to change necessarily stuff here, but to recognize that context that could influence some stuff.
That's a good point. Hadn't thought of that. I came off mute because I was going to say, Erica and Marilee, I'm going to follow up with you shortly, because I want to discuss some ideas for piloting.
Sounds great. All right, that's all that I had. I'll hand it back to you, Tammy, for any last words.
Okay, well, thank you, Erica, for leading us through that. There's a lot to think about there, and thank you, Pi. I'm sure you had a strong contribution to that too, and for having a foot in the world of automated driving, which is a lot more well funded than than we are. I think that's really helpful to be able to translate that kind of knowledge. Yeah, I think the biggest question is, what can we learn with a survey that people will take, right? There's so much we could ask, and so little patience for working through it. So there's definitely a lot to do. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.